I'm Miles. I got the chance to talk to Christie McLeod, founder and director of the Human Rights Hub, law student, as well as one of Corporate Knight's top Thursday under Thursday sustainability leaders of 2019, about her work. Here's our conversation. I firstly want to get a sense of exactly what aspect of your leadership and change making that you think you're most widely recognized for.
I think probably taking action on human rights issues. I think there's been several different campaigns or initiatives that I've either launched or been a part of. So probably human rights advocacy. So I was studying human rights in Winnipeg. I was doing an undergraduate degree in human rights and global studies and international development studies. And I found that there was a lot happening in Winnipeg's human rights sector, but there was no central space to learn about all of the great events and opportunities and initiatives and organizations working in this space. And so I decided to take action and partner with Global College, which is a college run out of the University of Winnipeg. And together we founded or applied for funding and received funding to create the Human Rights Hub, and I've managed that for the last 4 years.
You mentioned partnerships, and that would lead me to my next question of if you had to put a finger on who your people are with regards to who you work with and who you work for, or who your work is for.
I think largely the work that I do is for the general population, because it's usually trying to raise awareness about a human rights issue. It's often trying to push the government to give funding for something or to take a stance on something or create stronger laws. And so usually it's trying to create awareness to compel political will or motivation to take sufficient action. So I guess one thing I did recently was I created an open letter calling on Justin Trudeau and Minister Wilkinson, the new Environment Minister, federally, to introduce and legislate stronger emissions reduction targets. And that was signed on by more than 450 law students and law professors at law schools across Canada. And so that's sort of an action or example of an action where I was specifically targeting the legal profession or a part of the legal profession, but it was for a general audience in terms of seeking federal action on climate change.
Why do you think that you are empowered and passionate about educating the general population?
I think there's very important issues that need to be addressed, and so I think often raising awareness about human rights issues in particular is sort of the first step, because I feel that if people are aware about things, then, and perhaps this is, I don't know, idealistic, but I feel like hopefully awareness will compel action or outcry at inaction, and hopefully spark positive change.
And if somebody that knew you that didn't necessarily know who your people were, how did someone else know who your people were?
Something a professor told me recently was that I'm a doer. So I think I have ideas, and then I'm compelled to turn those ideas into actions or realities, and very passionate about human rights, environmental issues, social injustices. So kind of coupling of interest and passion around those interests, and then really striving to take action on those things and not just sit complacent with the inequalities that you see, but try to change them.
If you had to pinpoint one or two core values that you, at the very least, try to live up to on a day-to-day basis? What would those values be?
I think integrity is definitely one of them in terms of speaking up for justice and equality. I think once you're empowered with the knowledge of certain issues, it's it's deplorable if you don't try to take action to reduce them, or try to do all that you can within your personal circles and personal decisions and behaviors. So I think really trying to do the best that I can to make those changes, and make sure that I'm living up to the values that I espouse and say that I believe in. I think that's integrity would definitely be one of them.
That being said, what do you think motivates you to act on that value?
I think just a strong sense of justice and equality. I think that stems back to growing up. I was really raised about equality in terms of with a Christian background. I was taught about do unto yourself as you do unto others, like the golden rule. And I think that foundational belief transformed into a social justice belief, and belief that no one is more deserving of certain rights than others. No one deserves not to have their basic human needs met, especially within a country. There's no reason that some people should have basic needs and rights met, but others don't. And so I think really trying to reduce inequalities stems back to those core beliefs in justice and equality, and that's probably what what led me to law school to some extent. Is that firm belief in justice and wanting to reduce injustice.
Aside from the enrolling in law school, how else would somebody be able to look at you and know that that was one of your values without telling them explicitly?
I think just through my involvement with several organizations, I, I feel like it's pretty evident through the books that I read or the things that I post about, the things I talk about. It's pretty pertinent throughout everything I do.
I want to get a sense of the kind of future you want to make in the world, let's say by this time next year. And what role do you see yourself playing in making that future?
Well, next year will be 2020, and it's very clear from the climate experts and climate scientists that radical action needs to happen before 2030. And so 2020 will kick off the decade of our government's going to take meaningful climate action. And so if you want to cite, the IPCC says that we have to reduce emissions globally by 45% below 2010 levels by 2030. And then even more recently, the United Nations Environment Program says globally we have to reduce emissions by 7.6% each year between 20 and 2030. So there's drastic emissions reductions that needs to happen. And so far, there's not sufficient government will to undertake the meaningful climate action that's needed if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And so that's really on my mind, is this ticking time clock that's winding down. And 2020 will mark 10 years of are we going to take the action that we need. And that was why I created the open letter, was calling on Trudeau to really commit to making that action. And he committed to a 2050 net zero target. He didn't commit to doing anything in the next 30 years. It'll be far too late if serious action isn't taken now. So that's really high on my radar. And so I'm hoping to evaluate over the next month or so what can I do to influence that. When I created the open letter, I connected to a law student at each school that was involved in their environmental law club or was interested in environmental law. And so I think maybe creating a coalition to strengthen our voice and unify our voice to call for action is one route that I'm interested in taking. I'm part of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty working group. So that's kind of looking at maybe stopping or looking to stop supply side of fossil fuel expansion. In February, Canada is deciding whether to approve the Teck Frontier Mine, which would be the largest oil sands project to date, and it would produce 260,000 barrels of oil a day, and it would negate any chance we have essentially of meeting our climate commitments. And so I think there's a role for advocacy around that to try and influence the minister to not approve that because of the consequences it will have on Canada's ability to meet its climate commitment and the consequences of emitting that much when we have a very finite carbon budget that we can emit to limit warming. So those are a couple of things. I guess the only other thing is I've been writing my thesis on Canada's fair emission reduction target. And so trying to use that data to inform what Canada's emissions reduction target should be in relation to its emissions or its capabilities, responsibilities. There's a number of ways that you can define fairness, but all of them call for a significantly stronger target than Canada presently has. And so I think there might be opportunities there to use some of the data for advocacy efforts.
You mentioned the beginning of this decade ahead of us. So I now want to get a sense of where you personally see yourself halfway into that decade, around 2025.
I'll be a lawyer, and I'll have a law degree and a master's of environmental studies. And so I'm really hoping to channel my efforts into environment law as well as Aboriginal law in Canada. Yeah, I think continuing to stand up for injustices around the world and within our country and within the cities that we live in, and using the knowledge garnered through education and my experiences to continue to fight for social change.
And specifically with regards to Canada's reconciliation efforts, what's your current diagnosis on that matter with Indigenous peoples in Canada?
Canada has a long way to go. When Canada is still in court fighting compensation orders in terms of its underfunding of education on First Nations reserves, that's not reconciliation. That's the exact opposite of reconciliation, because you're forcing people to go to court and use their resources when they shouldn't need to. So I would definitely say that Canada has a long way to go. There have been incremental steps in the right direction. The Truth and Reconciliation's 94 calls to action are a wonderful resource that should be looked to as sort of a checklist or a guide of how to reconcile. I think one promising development is the passing of Bill 41 in BC. That's a bill to implement UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And so Canada could look towards that as a model to pass its own similar legislation to really enshrine rights in its legislation. But yeah, I think we have a long way to go.
Is there any specific content that was truly pivotal to your journey?
In terms of influencing me to go to law school, there was two pieces of work. One was a paper by David Boyd in the McGill Law Journal, I believe, and it's called No Taps, No Toilets. And it was about whether you could make a claim that First Nations communities have, or Indigenous peoples have, a constitutional right to water. And I was sitting there. I downloaded and printed this paper. Was sitting there trying to make sense of it all, and decided that I needed to go to law school to better understand it. If I was willing to spend my Sunday afternoon reading that paper, and then the second piece of work was a book called Invisible Chains by Benjamin Perrin, and it's about human trafficking in Canada. And they were talking about how Canada has a very narrow definition of human trafficking that's quite different from the UN definition and the Palermo Protocol that's been adopted by a lot of other nations. And so because of our very narrow definition of human trafficking, we weren't able to secure, Canada wasn't able to secure its first conviction under human trafficking until 2008, which is years and years after many other nations were. And so that really showed me how the law can influence the protection of human rights. And so understanding the importance of legislation and legal tools really sparked my interest in going to law school.